Is Kashmir at a crossroads? India extends a strict curfew on the restive region as separatist leaders call for more protests. 50 people have died in a month of unrest. So what is the solution to this latest crisis? And what will the Indian government do to address the grievances of Kashmiris? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Fuli Batibo. Mid-August is a time of celebration across most of India as people commemorate the country's independence. But in the northern region of Kashmir, this time of year often means heightened security and stifled expression. And this year is worse than usual. After a decade of relative stability, Kashmir has experienced more than a month of violence, triggered by the death of a prominent Kashmiri separatist, Burhan Wani. He was killed by Indian soldiers on July 8th. And Kashmiris across the region took to the streets to protest. Police swiftly imposed a curfew. Mobile networks have been suspended intermittently for the past month. And India's security forces have been accused of using unnecessary force. More than 50 protesters have been killed since July. Well, the seeds of the current Kashmir conflict were planted 70 years ago when India and Pakistan became independent states. They've been engaged in a tug-of-war over the region since then. Its borders have never been universally agreed upon. That's led to frequent violence, including 3 major wars. In 1949, the United Nations planned to hold a referendum in Kashmir to determine if the region would stay in India or secede. But India deemed the vote unnecessary 2 years later, and it never happened. Pro-independence fighters in Kashmir have regularly clashed with police since the 1950s, and protests can get violent. The Indian Army killed around 100 demonstrators at Gawakadal Bridge in 1990. Well, let's find out about the current situation in Kashmir and speak to Ala Fazili. He is a research scholar at the University of Kashmir and has been volunteering at Kashmir's main hospital for the past week. He is on the line from the regional capital, Srinagar. Thank you very much, Ala, for being on Al Jazeera. So it's been a month since the current unrest began in Kashmir Valley. Just how tense is the situation right now in Srinagar still?
Hi. Actually, it is now 36th day here in Kashmir on July 9th, when the people were still busy celebrating the Muslim festival of Eid. A fresh wave of state terror was unleashed by Indian armed forces to stop the people from joining the funeral of 21-year-old Burhan Wani, a popular resistance figure and a youth icon. Ever since, Indian occupation forces have recklessly used firearms and killed more than 60 people. It is not 50 people actually, because yesterday the count reached to 64 now. And more than 6,000 have been injured and over 400 blinded, disfigured or maimed for life. Hundreds, including minors, have been arbitrarily detained. The life, dignity and property is, I think, at the mercy of Indian state forces this time, which is led by a very militaristic regime there.
Okay.
And a small place like Jammu and Kashmir, it is a total war-like situation. And when we see, it has been till now almost... they have been using like these medieval firearms like pellet shotguns, which is actually blinding the people in their eyes, and the age range between 13 and 25.
Okay, you talk about a war-like situation. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Ala. You talk about a war-like situation. I know that separatist leaders have asked Kashmiris to march to the historic Red Square over the weekend to demand a referendum on the future of the region. I wonder, what's the mood among the people? Will they heed that call to protest? How determined are people to keep on protesting?
I think it has been throughout the valley. We are actually getting reports just now. Yes, from yesterday only, people have been preparing for this program after the Friday prayers. And yesterday evening, after the Friday prayers till evening, we received around 350 injuries. And in the morning, one boy died who had already been injured in a previous protest. So people have been planning, and they have been, I think, religiously following this resistance leadership program. And in the morning, there have been reports from all over the valley that people try to march towards Lajjo. But then the strict curfew, which has been placed here in whole of Kashmir Valley especially, And then in the evening, there were more forces, companies were deployed here in and around of the city. And this time I'm actually near the Srinagar city, and there are all entries towards the Srinagar city. They are closed. We tried from many sides to enter into this because we had to file some reports, but we were not allowed. And people have been waiting for it. So I think it has been, people are following very religiously the programs which are given by the resistance leadership and for their right to self-determination. Okay,
we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for telling us about the situation in Srinagar. Ala Fazil, a research scholar at the University of Kashmir, joining us there on the phone. Well, let's now bring in our other guests for today's Inside Story. Joining us here in Doha, Hafsa Kanjwa. She's a Kashmiri graduate scholar at the University of Michigan. She focuses on the history of the Kashmir protest movement. Also joining us from New Delhi, Vivek Kachu. He's a retired Indian Foreign Service officer and has previously represented India in Kashmiri dialogue with Pakistan. And also in New Delhi, Kavita Krishnan. She's a social rights activist as well as secretary of the All India Progressive Women's Association. Thank you all. Thank you for being on this edition of Inside Story. Hafsa in the studio here in Doha with me. If I can start with you. Kashmir, of course, is no stranger to unrest, but some people have described the current situation and the anger among Kashmiris as a new phase in the freedom struggle. Do you share that sentiment? Do you think that we are at a turning point here? How does this uprising basically compare to the previous ones we've seen?
I would say that the new phase actually started in 2008 when the first series of nonviolent protests against Indian rule began, and they continued until 2016. But today what we see is that the youth are actually very much in charge. They are dictating the terms of where this movement is going to be headed. And even though the older pro-freedom leadership has been involved and they're issuing out protest calendars, they're sort of on the ride. It's the youth who are on the streets, along with men, women, and children, that are going outside of their homes, knowing that they will very likely be shot or harassed or beaten up, but very absolute in their demand for self-determination.
So do you think then that we are in a now or never situation, as some people have said it is right now?
It seems that for now the people are very resolute that the agitation continues until something is resolved on the ground, until a political solution is reached. Unfortunately, what we see from the Indian leadership is much of the same. They're not willing to budge on their stance, and they're only getting increasingly more violent in Kashmir to try to suppress the people and their right to dissent.
Okay. Well, let's hear from Kavita Krishnan in New Delhi. Kavita, the killing of Burhan Wani, this Kashmiri leader, and the ensuing violence in Jammu and Kashmir has been interpreted in many ways, of course. And the Indian government has said that what we're seeing right now is separatist violence, but many others have viewed it as a human rights issue. What's your sentiment on this?
No, I think that that's a wrong way of formulating it. It is certainly not only a human rights issue. It is a political movement. And I think that the key issue here is that the Indian state, the Indian government, is unwilling to see it as a political issue, look at it in the face as a political issue. So they're dealing with it with the most unmitigated brutality. And, the Prime Minister has recently issued statements about looking at Kashmir through the lens of humanity. And yet, as the speaker before me described, the most inhumane methods of pellet guns and killings are being deployed against Kashmiri civilians. And the other thing the Prime Minister has said is that he's willing to address the genuine grievances of the Kashmiri people. That phrase is a telltale giveaway, because that means that he is unwilling to see the central issue of self-determination as a genuine issue at all. And I think that political dialogue can only begin when the Indian government is willing to address that central issue. The street protests also may stop only when there's a serious offer of a political resolution, a serious offer of political talks on the table, which I don't see happening in the near future because the government's attitude seems so completely far removed from this.
Okay, well, speaking of the methods that have been used by the Indian security forces in Kashmir, one key element of the Kashmir conflict is the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which was passed in 1990. It gives Indian soldiers in Kashmir the right to use lethal force when breaking up protests, lets them arrest and search citizens without warrant, and provides them with legal immunity for their actions across Kashmir. The government says AFSPA protects India's territorial integrity and its citizens, but critics say it authorizes unnecessary force and human rights violations. Let me bring in Vivek Kachchu now in New Delhi. Vivek, the Indian government has been accused of using heavy-handed tactics against Kashmiris and basically of committing widespread abuses. What has been the government's response to this? Are they investigating these claims of abuse?
No, I contest the idea that the armed forces have any kind of impunity despite the AFSPA. The fact is that the armed forces, like in any democratic society, have to be governed by rules, though in this case, in regions of unrest, they have a certain latitude and the armed forces acts apply. That is the first point. Second, what we are facing in Kashmir and have faced in Kashmir over the last many decades is unmitigated cross-border terrorism from Pakistan, which has vitiated the possibility of any kind of dialogue.
But with all due respect, sir, it wasn't Pakistan that sparked the latest violence, was it? It wasn't the Pakistani army, but the Indian army that killed this separatist leader.
The Indian army did absolutely right. No separatist terrorist who is a member of a terrorist organization like the Hizbul Mujahideen can be allowed a free hand. If anyone picks the gun, then the person will face the consequences of picking up the gun. That is seen in various governments' actions against terrorism. And terrorism is not unique to India. It is a worldwide scourge which is being combated by many civilized governments.
Okay, I think Kavita Krishnan would like to respond to what you just said.
Yeah, I'd like to come in here.
Yes, go ahead, Kavita.
Yes. Yeah. I want to say here that this is a kind of standard practice of Indian governments where they've seen the entire issue of Kashmir as something that is sponsored by Pakistan and that is equivalent to terrorism. I'm not saying that there has been no terrorism in that region, but it is acknowledged even by Indian establishment voices that in fact militancy in the valley, in the Kashmir valley, had gone down. What you're seeing now is civilians on the streets. And to see this as a purely Pakistani-sponsored thing is a sleight of hand, which allows you to justify the use of brutal force, even when it comes to groups, separatist groups like the Hizbul Mujahideen. I would like to remind that former prime ministers, even from the same party to which the Indian prime minister today belongs, have held talks with those same separatist groups. So what is it that stops the present government of the day from initiating dialogue, initiating talks with separatist groups? Because it's obvious that Kashmir is a political issue. You have an entire people on the streets rejecting Indian authority and Indian legitimacy there. So that is clearly a political issue. You can't deal with it simply by pellet guns and bullets. You can't deal with it by calling them all terrorists. Okay. That's pretty obvious.
Let's allow Mr. Vivek to answer.
Factor there.
Kavita, sorry, we have a lot to talk about. Let's allow Mr. Vivek to answer what you just said.
The fact is that Pakistani intrusiveness in the affairs of Jammu and Kashmir has been going on since decades. And the Indian authorities have acted within the constitution. Ms. Kavita Krishnan may have her views, but the views expressed in Parliament regarding the political aspects of the dialogue between opinion in the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir and the federal authorities has to take place within the confines of the Indian constitution. Okay. It cannot be any other way, and that is the consensus in Parliament. It was reflected in the joint resolutions of Parliament.
Prime Minister Vajpayee, Mr. Kajju, when
no Prime Minister, Ms. Krishnan, can act outside the Constitution.
The ambit of the Constitution said it would happen. Then Prime Minister Vajpayee said it would happen within the scope of humanity. He said that in a specific response to a question. I say that only
so
to
did
remind
the present Prime Minister.
these are phrases being used. The real issue here is what is stopping the Indian Prime Minister from talking to the people of Kashmir?
Let us find out about the issues. I'm going to interrupt both of you because this obviously is a very heated discussion, but we do have to understand the background to all this a little bit. And I want to bring in, once again, Hafsa here in Doha with me. Explain to our international audience, what are the demands of the Kashmiri people today? There is talk of independence, of course, talk of secession. But is that something that every Kashmiri wants today? What exactly are they asking the Indian government?
I would dispute the word secession because Kashmir's accession to India was never final. In 1948 or in 1947-48, when Kashmir acceded to the Indian Union, there was to be a plebiscite that was to be held to determine whether they would join India or Pakistan at the time, right? So Kashmir is not seceding from the Indian Union if it goes away. In the past 70 years, that plebiscite has never taken place for a number of reasons. And what people want right now on the street is the right to determine their future. So for sure we will have...
So they want a referendum?
They want a referendum. Okay. And in that referendum, a third option must be included, which is independence. And that's because the global landscape has changed and that since the late 1980s, Kashmiris are increasingly sort of contesting the nationalisms of both Pakistan and India, and many people want independence. That is not to say that there's not a pro-Pakistan contingency within Kashmir right now. There certainly is, and we do see people raising Pakistan flags and raising Pakistan slogans. But what we need to understand is that that might be a sentiment towards Pakistan, but could also be a sentiment or strategy to provoke the Indian forces.
Right. Because, again, Mr. Vivek has talked about Pakistan, and this is the argument that comes up very often. And I want to ask you about this, Mr. Vivek Kachu. Some would say it's very easy for the Indian government to blame Pakistan and stoke nationalist sentiment, because what we're looking at here is really an Indian majority Muslim province, Kashmir. If Pakistan, as you claim, is influencing the people there and the protests there, it means that India is not doing something right. It means that India is not addressing the grievances of this majority Muslim province, does it not?
No, it does not. Pakistan has used force. It has used brutal methods, including killing of Kashmiri leaders, to ensure that its intrusiveness remains. Besides, let me point out that as far as the plebiscite and the UN resolutions are concerned, Pakistan did not take the necessary steps which required a withdrawal of Pakistani forces from the territories which are under their illegal and forcible control as a first necessary and essential step for the plebiscite. And that story was over many decades ago. The UN has never taken this up after 1957 as far as the plebiscite is concerned. History moves on. History cannot remain tethered to certain actions which were taken 70 years ago. We are faced with a contemporary situation and we are faced with cross-border terrorism for over 2 decades.
Kavita Krishnan, your response.
I'd like to intervene. Yes. I'd like to say here that, look, it's very clear that the problem of cross-border terrorism has certainly not remained the same for the last couple of decades. The situation has certainly changed there. And this is something which even Indian establishment voices have conceded. But what I'd like to point out is that, the Indian Prime Minister using the question of atrocities in Balochistan in a kind of whataboutery kind of phrase in order to justify atrocities by the Indian state in Kashmir, I think that this is taking us nowhere. And I would reiterate here that the question of self-determination in Kashmir needs to be looked at head-on. It needs to be recognized as the central key political issue in Kashmir.
It will never be looked at.
Whatever the final resolution, whether the resolution, what shape, well, that's the problem, right? Because if you're not going to look at it as a political issue, you're going to treat the civilian population as though, as though you're waging a war against the civilian people of Kashmir. You're using pellet guns against children, against young people there. You're only aggravating the problem there. You're actually taking the whole issue further away from a political solution. And I think that is really the key problem here, the intransigence with which Indian establishment voices are saying, we refuse to recognize the problem. So if you won't even recognize the problem, you are not taking a step towards the solution.
Okay, let's bring in Mr. Vivek Kachu once again. What is the solution to this problem? Mr. Kachu, yes, you can respond. And also, I want to hear your thoughts about what the solution to the problem is, because we heard Prime Minister Narendra Modi yesterday on Friday make some pretty incendiary comments, not wanting to ease the tensions, on the contrary, not wanting to talk to the Kashmiri people, not wanting to hear about their grievances. So I wonder, how does the Indian government then, if not listening to the people, how does it address this issue?
There is a government in the state, an elected government in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. The Prime Minister has never said that he will not listen to the people of Jammu and Kashmir. I think this is a travesty of fact. Second, the state is constitutionally part of the union, so any political solution obviously has to be within the confines of the Constitution of India. Third, I think whenever there is talk of self-determination, there simply can't be such talk in a plural democratic order, which India is.
So what did Prime Minister Modi mean then on Friday? Mr. Kachu, what did Prime Minister Modi mean when he spoke on Friday and said that this is no time for talks, this is what he said, and that this is a time for security? What does that mean?
No. The Prime Minister said, as indeed both houses of Parliament said, that, and naturally that security considerations have to be given due importance. But that does not mean that reaching out with different sections of opinion in Jammu and Kashmir cannot take place simultaneously. After all, if there is a security situation, it has to be combated by the security forces. And I do believe that the security forces have suffered injuries, and this is something which is not generally talked about. They have suffered more injuries than the demonstrators in Jammu and Kashmir.
How many of them have been blinded? How many of them have been blinded, Mr. Vivek Kachu? How many security forces have lost their eyes?
The use of
in the manner in which Kashmiri children, Kashmiri youth are losing their eyes. What is this comparison? I mean, I think that...
You know, I'm surprised. May I say something here?
Go ahead, Mr. Kachu.
The fact that young children of 10 and 12, the fact that young children of 10 and 12 are being allowed and being pushed into these demonstrations, have been asked to pick up stones.
No, they're not being pushed. They're standing in their own homes, in their balconies, and being shot. There was...
Yes,
that is an interesting point. I do want to talk about that. It's a fair point to ask. What about the Kashmiri leadership responsibility in this? Many people have been killed, including children. Is it right for the Kashmiri leadership to call on children to take to the streets?
I would like to point out firstly that this current movement is not in the control of any leadership in Kashmir. Anybody who watches Kashmir knows this. This time it's a spontaneous upsurge. Secondly, the children being killed have not been part of the protests. The little children, the 1-year-olds, the 2-year-olds, the 10-year-olds have not been part of the protests. There was a little... Please, there is. I do know that. This is a spontaneous upsurge. And let me remind you that the latest little girl to have had her eyesight taken away is she's here in Delhi for treatment now. She's someone who stood in the balcony of her house. She opened a window and she had a pellet gun in her eyes and lost her eyes. There are little children in the arms of their parents who have nothing to do with the have lost their eyesight.
Let me bring in Hafsa
guns which are meant for animals being used against the people of Kashmir.
Let me bring in Hafsa Kanjwal. Hafsa, quickly, please, how do you see the situation evolving in the next few days, in the next few weeks? What is the minimum the people of Kashmir would accept today from the Indian government in order to stop protesting?
I just wanted to make one quick point in that the issue is not about security. When you have the Indian forces punishing and suppressing people, children, men and women, for demanding their right to freedom, it's not about security. They're not fighting against militants. They're not fighting against terrorists sponsored by Pakistan. They're fighting against the entire civilian population of Kashmir. And that is a fact that people like Mr. Vivek here don't seem to understand. In terms of what needs to happen, I think India wants that there is going to be fatigue in Kashmir, right? You can't have people for over months and weeks at a time that are unable to access food and have been curfewed inside of their homes and have been beaten mercilessly for going outside of their homes. So in the past, there has been incidences where this has occurred for 2 months, 3 months at a time, but has then sort of died down. But the thing is that it seems this time that people have known their mistakes from the past, that the leadership had succumbed to compromises with the Indian government. And now it's gone beyond that leadership.
Okay. Yeah, we'll have to see how the situation evolves. Thank you so much. This was a very interesting discussion, a heated one, but thank you for teaching us and showing us about the situation in Kashmir. Thank you, Hafsa Kanjwa, Vivek Kachu, and Kavita Krishnan. Thank you all for being on Inside Story. And thank you as well for watching. You can also always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can join the conversation on Twitter as well. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Foli Batibo, and the whole team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.